Isfahan, winter of 1622, bootsteps echo across polished marble floors. A young prince is marched between two lines of silent guards, his face pale, his wide eyes stripped of hope. In the gilded hall, Shah Abbas sits motionless on his throne, the lamplight casting bronze shadows across his hardened features. His voice cuts through the air, dry, unshaking. Take his eyes. A scream tears through the chamber, swallowed by the clang of an iron door. This was the man who had saved his empire, who had built Isfahan into the jewel of the East, yet now he had destroyed his own bloodline with his own command. The answer lies in the story you're about to hear, one that is not just about a king's cruelty, but about the darkness that grows when power is left unchecked. To understand how a man could order the blinding of his own son, we have to go back to a time when Shah Abbas was not yet a king, not yet the great ruler sung about in Persian poetry, but simply a boy, born into a palace that was both a home and a cage. The year was 1571. The Safavid Empire stretched from the lush shores of the Caspian Sea to the burning deserts near the Persian Gulf. But despite its glittering facade, the empire was fracturing. The Ottomans pressed from the west, the Uzbeks from the northeast, and inside the royal court, ambition simmered like a pot left too long over the fire. Abbas was born into this storm, a prince in name, but a hostage to forces beyond his control. From the very beginning, the walls of the royal palace in Qazvin whispered with intrigue. Servants learned to keep their eyes lowered and their mouths shut. Courtiers smiled as they slid knives between each other's backs, not steel knives, but words, rumours, and calculated slanders. Abbas's father, Muhammad Khordadbanda, was the Shah in name, but nearly blind and politically weak. His mother, Kir al-Nisa Begum, known as Mahde-Olia, tried to wield power in his place, and in doing so made enemies in every corner of the court. Abbas's earliest memories were not of carefree play in gardens, but of hushed conversations abruptly ending when he entered a room, of doors that closed just a second too quickly, of his mother's face tight with worry as she listened to messengers deliver news that another provincial governor had declared his own independence, that another army had marched under a different banner. Then came the day the palace changed forever. He was barely 8 years old when armed men stormed the royal chambers. They came not for him, but for his mother. In a flash of violence and betrayal, she was strangled by rivals, her body taken away before Abbas could even understand what had happened. To the boy, it was not just a murder, it was a message. In this world, love and loyalty were fragile things, easily snuffed out by ambition. From that moment, trust became a rare currency for Abbas. He learned to watch, to listen, to measure every word before speaking. The boy who once might have run freely through the palace gardens now walked carefully, as if the marble floors themselves might betray him. The political instability of the Safavid court deepened. Powerful emirs treated the Shah like a ceremonial puppet. Provinces slipped away to Ottoman or Uzbek control, and in the chaos, Abbas was used as a bargaining chip, shifted from one guardian to another, sometimes held in what was effectively gilded captivity. By his teenage years, he had learned a cruel truth. In the Safavid Empire, even blood ties could not protect you from being sacrificed for political convenience. He had seen uncles executed, cousins exiled, and brothers poisoned, all in the name of protecting the dynasty. One incident etched itself into his mind forever. A visiting dignitary, after being granted an audience with the Shah, left behind a quiet warning whispered to Abbas in the garden. "Never forget, young prince, here, your enemy will shake your hand before he cuts your throat." Abbas smiled politely, but those words became a seed in his mind, one that would grow in the shadows over the years. Outside the palace, Persia was bleeding. The Ottomans had seized Tabriz, one of the empire's crown jewels. The Uzbeks raided deeper into Khorasan, leaving scorched fields and shattered villages in their wake. Refugees poured into the cities, carrying stories of brutality and famine. The once proud Safavid army was fractured, many of its soldiers more loyal to local warlords than to the Shah. Inside Abbas, a quiet resolve began to form. He would not be a puppet. He would not let himself be the next casualty of palace intrigue. If the world was a game of betrayal, he would learn to play it better than anyone else. But along with that resolve came something darker, the belief that trust was a weakness, that mercy was an open door to one's own destruction. At 17, fate gave him his chance. With the backing of powerful Qizilbash factions tired of his father's weakness, Abbas was elevated to the throne in 1588. But even in that moment of triumph, the boy who had grown up in fear still looked over his shoulder. He knew that the same forces that had placed him on the throne could, with a whisper and a dagger, remove him from it. From the very start of his reign, Abbas ruled with two weapons, reform and suspicion. The reforms would make him a celebrated figure in history, reorganising the army, revitalising trade, building cities that dazzled the world. The suspicion would turn him into something else entirely, a man who could not sleep unless he had destroyed every possible threat, even if it meant destroying those closest to him. But all of that, the victories, the betrayals, the family tragedies, was still in the future. In 1588, as he sat on the Safavid throne for the first time, the shadows of his childhood were already shaping the man he would become, and somewhere, buried deep in those shadows, was the first glimmer of the cruelty that would one day blind his own son. The coronation of Abbas in 1588 was not the triumphant, uncontested ascent that chroniclers sometimes like to imagine. The throne was his, yes, but only because others wanted it that way. And in the Safavid Empire, that was as much a danger as it was a blessing. Abbas inherited a realm on the edge of collapse. The Ottomans held large swathes of the west. The Uzbeks pushed hard from the northeast, threatening the empire's economic heartlands. Internal rivals, provincial governors and Qizilbash tribal chiefs, ruled their territories like independent kingdoms. The Shah's authority, which should have been absolute, was in reality only as strong as the loyalty of the men standing in his court. The young ruler could have chosen to follow the path of many before him, maintain fragile alliances, appease the tribal elites, and hope the empire would hold together. But Abbas had grown up in a court where appeasement led only to death. He had no intention of being a figurehead. His first years on the throne were spent doing something dangerous, rebuilding the foundations of royal power. He began with the army. The Qizilbash cavalry, the backbone of Safavid military might for over a century, had grown arrogant and politically unruly. Abbas could not simply destroy them. They were still the empire's most formidable warriors. Instead, he set about balancing their influence by creating new forces loyal only to him. From the Caucasus, he imported thousands of gulams, Christian boys taken as captives in war, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers and administrators. To the Qizilbash elite, this was an insult. Foreigners in the service of the Shah granted ranks and rewards that rivaled their own. But to Abbas, it was insurance. These gulams had no tribal loyalties, no stake in local power struggles. Their future depended entirely on his favour. Reforms extended beyond the army. Abbas reorganised the empire's finances, shifting tax collection from local governors to centrally appointed officials. The move cut into the wealth of the provincial elite, but it gave the Shah more direct control over revenue, and with revenue came freedom. Freedom to wage war, to fund his court, to build a capital that would outshine every rival city from Constantinople to Delhi. In 1598, Abbas moved the capital from Qazvin to Isfahan, a city he would transform into the glittering heart of the empire. The move was strategic. Isfahan lay further from the Ottoman frontier, safer from invasion, and closer to the trade routes that brought silk, spices, and precious metals into Persia. But it was also symbolic. The new city would be a testament to his reign, a place where his vision of centralized power and imperial grandeur would be written in stone and tile. Construction began almost immediately. The Naqshi Jahan Square, one of the largest city squares in the world, rose in the centre of Isfahan, flanked by mosques, palaces, and the imperial bazaar. Blue tiles glistened under the desert sun. Marble fountains mirrored the clouds drifting overhead. Artisans from across the empire and beyond were summoned to adorn the city with intricate calligraphy and geometric designs. For the people of Persia, the transformation was intoxicating. Merchants thrived as Isfahan became a hub of international trade. Caravanserais offered safe passage for goods travelling the Silk Road. Artists, poets, and scholars flocked to the capital, drawn by royal patronage and the promise of a cosmopolitan audience. To the outside world, Abbas appeared as the very image of a just and enlightened monarch. European envoys wrote admiringly of his court, praising his reforms, his interest in commerce, and his tolerance toward Christian merchants and missionaries. The Ottomans, though still powerful, began to feel the sting of his military recovery. The Uzbeks, pushed back by his campaigns, could no longer raid Persian lands with impunity. But behind the magnificence of his public image, the boy who had grown up in the shadows of betrayal still ruled. Every step forward was accompanied by calculation. How would this policy strengthen him? How would it weaken potential rivals? Abbas did not build without thinking of control, and he did not give without expecting loyalty in return. His ghulams were rewarded lavishly, but their families were kept under watch. Governors who served well were honoured, but the moment their popularity threatened to rival his own, they were reassigned or quietly removed. Abbas smiled at visiting ambassadors, yet behind the closed doors of the Ali Kapu palace, he interrogated his spies for whispers of disloyalty. And yet, for all his suspicion, he knew how to project warmth when it suited him. Abbas walked the streets of Isfahan in disguise, speaking with merchants, listening to grievances, showing himself as a ruler in touch with his people. These public forays built a legend, the Shah who cared for even the humblest of his subjects. But they also gave him valuable information, what the people were saying, who they feared, who they loved. In the mind of Abbas, even kindness could be a tool for control. By the turn of the century, the empire was no longer on the brink of collapse. Roads were safer, the treasury was filling again. Isfahan was becoming the jewel he had envisioned. The Ottomans and Uzbeks had learned to respect Persian armies once more. Abbas had earned the title the Great in the eyes of his subjects. But the very traits that made him successful, his tireless vigilance, his refusal to trust, his readiness to strike first, were also laying the groundwork for the tragedies to come. The seeds of suspicion planted in his childhood had grown into towering walls, shutting out not only his enemies but also his family. In public, the Shah's face was serene, his voice calm, his rule unquestioned. In private, the man who had once been a frightened boy in Kazvin still watched for daggers in the dark. And in that mindset, the idea of striking at a threat, no matter how close to his heart, was already becoming thinkable. Power in the Safavid court was never static. It flowed like a river, sometimes wide and calm, sometimes narrow and violent, shifting with the seasons of loyalty and betrayal. Shah Abbas understood this better than anyone. He had seen kings undone by hesitation. He had no intention of making the same mistake. By the mid-1590s, Abbas had secured his throne and restored much of the empire's strength. But stability was a fragile thing, and in Persia, fragility was dangerous. The Kizilbash tribal chiefs, though diminished, still commanded loyalty in the provinces. Ambitious governors could turn local armies into personal fiefdoms. Even members of the royal family could become rallying points for discontent. Abbas's solution was simple in concept, ruthless in execution. Eliminate the possibility of rebellion before it could take shape. And that meant striking at the very people who might one day challenge him. It began subtly. Governors whose loyalty wavered were quietly recalled to Isfahan, stripped of their offices, and replaced by Ghulam commanders who owed their entire careers to the Shah. The Ghulams were outsiders, Georgian, Circassian, Armenian, men with no deep tribal roots in Persia. They could not build independent power bases without Abbas noticing. The purge soon extended to the royal family. Princes who might have been groomed for provincial leadership found themselves kept close to the palace, ostensibly for their safety, but in reality under constant surveillance. Abbas remembered all too well how his own uncles had used distance from the capital to cultivate rebellion. In 1595, a distant cousin was accused of conspiring with disaffected governors in the northwest. Whether the evidence was genuine or fabricated hardly mattered. He was arrested, interrogated, and, without public trial, executed. To the court it was a warning. To Abbas it was a precaution. The cycle repeated itself. Accusations of treason became more common, especially among those whose popularity rivaled the Shah's. A prince who drew too much admiration from the army, a governor praised too warmly by merchants, even a court poet whose verses seemed to hint at criticism, all could find themselves suddenly in disgrace. Outside the palace, Abbas's reputation was still untarnished. Merchants spoke of the safety of the roads, scholars marvelled at the libraries of Isfahan, foreign envoys praised the Shah's intelligence and charm. But inside the royal court a different story was unfolding, a story of silenced voices and disappearing rivals. One of the most telling examples came when Abbas reorganized the administration of the empire's border provinces. These were the most vulnerable regions, where Ottoman or Uzbek influence could easily seep in. Traditionally, these posts had been entrusted to princes or high-ranking nobles of Persian birth. Abbas broke with that tradition. He appointed ghulams, often young and untested, over experienced Persian commanders. The move shocked the court, but Abbas was unyielding. To him, loyalty mattered more than lineage or competence. A mediocre commander who would die for him was far more valuable than a brilliant one who might one day lead a revolt. His suspicion began to shape not only his political choices, but also his personal relationships. He rarely allowed any single advisor to gain too much influence. Those who grew close to him often found themselves suddenly demoted or sent to distant postings, sometimes without explanation. It was a deliberate tactic to keep everyone slightly off balance. In private moments, Abbas could still be warm, even affectionate, but those moments were rare and fleeting. The boy who had once been wounded by betrayal had grown into a man who preemptively struck at anything resembling it. The toll on the royal family was immense. Brothers, cousins, and nephews lived under constant watch. Some disappeared into quiet exile, others into shallow graves. Fear began to replace affection in the palace corridors. Servants lowered their voices even in empty rooms, unsure of who might be listening. And yet, to the outside observer, Abbas's policies seemed to be working. The empire's borders were more secure, the treasury was swelling, Isfahan was unmatched in beauty and trade. The Shah's grip on power had never been stronger. But beneath the polished marble of his reign, cracks were forming. The very methods that kept him safe were eroding the trust and loyalty of those around him. A ruler can command obedience through fear, but fear corrodes the bonds that hold a dynasty together. In 1603, when Abbas launched a brilliant military campaign to reclaim Tabriz from the Ottomans, the victory was celebrated across the empire. Yet even in the glow of triumph, his court knew, the more the Shah achieved, the more paranoid he became. Glory abroad was matched by quiet purges at home. The stage was set for darker decisions. The man who had once been the saviour of Persia was beginning to see threats not just in his enemies, but in his own blood. Power in the Safavid court was never static. It flowed like a river, sometimes wide and calm, sometimes narrow and violent, shifting with the seasons of loyalty and betrayal. Shah Abbas understood this better than anyone. He had seen kings undone by hesitation. He had no intention of making the same mistake. By the mid-1590s, Abbas had secured his throne and restored much of the empire's strength. But stability was a fragile thing, and in Persia, fragility was dangerous. The Kizilbash tribal chiefs, though diminished, still commanded loyalty in the provinces. Ambitious governors could turn local armies into personal fiefdoms. Even members of the royal family could become rallying points for discontent. Abbas's solution was simple in concept, ruthless in execution: eliminate the possibility of rebellion before it could take shape. And that meant striking at the very people who might one day challenge him. It began subtly. Governors whose loyalty wavered were quietly recalled to Isfahan, stripped of their offices, and replaced by ghulam commanders who owed their entire careers to the Shah. The ghulams were outsiders: Georgian, Circassian, Armenian, men with no deep tribal roots in Persia. They could not build independent power bases without Abbas noticing. The purge soon extended to the royal family. Princes who might have been groomed for provincial leadership found themselves kept close to the palace, ostensibly for their safety, but in reality under constant surveillance. Abbas remembered all too well how his own uncles had used distance from the capital to cultivate rebellion. In 1595, a distant cousin was accused of conspiring with disaffected governors in the northwest. Whether the evidence was genuine or fabricated hardly mattered. He was arrested, interrogated, and, without public trial, executed. To the court it was a warning. To Abbas it was a precaution. The cycle repeated itself. Accusations of treason became more common, especially among those whose popularity rivaled the Shah's. A prince who drew too much admiration from the army, a governor praised too warmly by merchants, even a court poet whose verses seemed to hint at criticism. All could find themselves suddenly in disgrace. Outside the palace, Abbas's reputation was still untarnished. Merchants spoke of the safety of the roads, scholars marvelled at the libraries of Isfahan, foreign envoys praised the Shah's intelligence and charm. But inside the royal court a different story was unfolding, a story of silenced voices and disappearing rivals. One of the most telling examples came when Abbas reorganized the administration of the empire's border provinces. These were the most vulnerable regions, where Ottoman or Uzbek influence could easily seep in. Traditionally, these posts had been entrusted to princes or high-ranking nobles of Persian birth. Abbas broke with that tradition. He appointed ghulams, often young and untested, over experienced Persian commanders. The move shocked the court, but Abbas was unyielding. To him, loyalty mattered more than lineage or competence. A mediocre commander who would die for him was far more valuable than a brilliant one who might one day lead a revolt. His suspicion began to shape not only his political choices, but also his personal relationships. He rarely allowed any single advisor to gain too much influence. Those who grew close to him often found themselves suddenly demoted or sent to distant postings, sometimes without explanation. It was a deliberate tactic to keep everyone slightly off balance. In private moments, Abbas could still be warm, even affectionate, but those moments were rare and fleeting. The boy who'd once been wounded by betrayal had grown into a man who preemptively struck at anything resembling it. The toll on the royal family was immense. Brothers, cousins, and nephews lived under constant watch. Some disappeared into quiet exile, others into shallow graves. Fear began to replace affection in the palace corridors. Servants lowered their voices even in empty rooms, unsure of who might be listening. And yet, to the outside observer, Abbas's policies seemed to be working. The empire's borders were more secure, the treasury was swelling, Isfahan was unmatched in beauty and trade. The Shah's grip on power had never been stronger. But beneath the polished marble of his reign, cracks were forming. The very methods that kept him safe were eroding the trust and loyalty of those around him. A ruler can command obedience through fear, but fear corrodes the bonds that hold a dynasty together. In 1603, when Abbas launched a brilliant military campaign to reclaim Tabriz from the Ottomans, the victory was celebrated across the empire. Yet even in the glow of triumph, his court knew, the more the Shah achieved, the more paranoid he became. Glory abroad was matched by quiet purges at home. The stage was set for darker decisions. The man who had once been the saviour of Persia was beginning to see threats not just in his enemies, but in his own blood. By the second decade of the 1600s, Shah Abbas stood at the height of his power. The empire's borders were secure, trade was thriving, and Isfahan gleamed like a jewel in the desert. Foreign ambassadors returned home speaking of a ruler both wise and formidable. But inside the walls of the Ali Kappu palace, a different story unfolded. Abbas's victories abroad had not eased the suspicion that ruled his heart. If anything, triumph had made him more wary. A ruler who had spent his youth watching uncles and cousins turn into rivals could never see family as purely family. Blood was not a shield, it was a reminder that those closest to you were also closest to your throne. The object of his growing fear was his own sons. Prince Muhammad Bakr, his eldest, was everything a future king might need to be: intelligent, skilled in politics, and beloved by the people. Bakr had accompanied his father on military campaigns, earning respect from soldiers and commoners alike. He was charismatic in a way Abbas was not, open, approachable, and willing to listen without judgment. For most fathers, such qualities in a son would be a source of pride. For Abbas, they were a warning. In the Safavid court, popularity could be as dangerous as treason. A beloved prince might inspire loyalty that outshone the Shah's own. Rumours began to reach Abbas through his web of spies. Whispers that certain nobles preferred Baker's leadership style, that the prince's judgment was more temperate than his father's, that some even dreamed of seeing him ascend the throne before Abbas's death. Whether these were genuine sentiments or fabrications planted by schemers hardly mattered. Once suspicion took root in Abbas's mind, it grew like a vine, twisting every fact into confirmation. By 1615, the relationship between father and son had cooled into something brittle. Court banquets became tense affairs. Baker's every public appearance was monitored, his every ally noted. Then, in a move that stunned even seasoned courtiers, Abbas ordered the prince's arrest on charges of conspiracy. The trial, if it could be called that, was swift. Abbas did not need proof in the legal sense, only the conviction in his own mind that Baker was a threat. The prince was executed quietly, without spectacle. The news spread through Isfahan in whispers, the people speaking his name as if afraid it might still reach the Shah's ears. If killing Baker was the breaking point for public sentiment, it was only the midpoint of Abbas's private campaign against his heirs. His other sons, Imam Koli Mirza and Muhammad Mirza, were still alive, but not for long, not in the way princes were meant to live. Abbas, determined to ensure that no son could challenge him, ordered that they be blinded. In the Safavid dynasty, physical perfection was a requirement for kingship. A man without sight could never sit on the throne. the blinding was carried out under the cold precision of royal command. No public executions, no crowds, just the quiet efficiency of a ruler who wanted results without spectacle. Guards led the princes away from the palace. When they returned, they were broken men, their futures reduced to shadows. Abbas justified these acts as necessary for the stability of the empire. Without a clear, unthreatened ruler, he argued, the Safavid state would be torn apart by factions, yet in eliminating his sons, he was also eliminating the dynasty's most capable future leaders. The court grew quieter after that. Those who might have spoken against him learned that even royal blood offered no protection. Conversations became shorter, voices lower. Abbas was surrounded not by family or equals, but by courtiers who owed him everything and feared him entirely. In the eyes of his subjects, Abbas remained the Great. He still appeared in public, still rode through the streets in ceremonial splendour, still commissioned grand buildings and sponsored trade caravans. But the laughter of his sons no longer echoed through the palace gardens, and the future of the Safavid throne had been reduced to a handful of distant relatives. What had begun as a policy of securing power had turned into the systematic destruction of his own bloodline. And while the empire seemed strong from the outside, the seeds of its eventual decline had already been sown by the very hand that had once lifted them to greatness. After the deaths and maimings of his sons, the palace of Shah Abbas grew quieter, not with peace, but with the suffocating stillness that follows a storm. The laughter of heirs was gone. The vibrant conversations that once spilled out from the royal gardens into the courtyards had faded into murmurs behind closed doors. Abbas had what he thought he wanted. No challengers to his throne, no family member who could rally a faction against him. But the price was the echoing emptiness of a dynasty without a future. Those who remained around him were careful men, ministers who knew better than to speak an unwelcome truth, commanders who delivered victories but never claimed too much credit, courtiers who praised his every word yet never met his eyes for too long. They were loyal, yes, but their loyalty was rooted in fear, not love. Abbas moved through this curated world with the calm precision of a man who believed control was safety, yet there were cracks in the armour. At times, when the grand square of Isfahan buzzed with merchants and children playing in the fountains, he would pause just for a moment and watch. Perhaps he saw in them a life he had denied his own sons, perhaps not. His face revealed nothing. His relationship with the memory of Muhammad Baqir was especially fraught. Publicly, Abbas never spoke of the eldest prince. Privately, there were whispers among palace servants that he sometimes walked alone to the small garden where Baker had once practiced archery. He would stand there, silent for long stretches, before returning to the palace without a word. The void left by his heirs also forced Abbas to think of succession in new, uncomfortable ways. With no surviving sons fit to rule, the line of succession moved to more distant relatives, men who had not been groomed for the throne, whose loyalty was untested, whose talents were uncertain. The security he had bought by removing threats in the short term was beginning to look like instability in the long term. Still, Abbas remained a king of action. He continued to oversee grand projects in Isfahan, expanding its gardens, commissioning new bridges, and sponsoring works of art that would become the envy of the Islamic world. Foreign visitors marvelled at his energy and vision. To them, the Shah seemed tireless, a ruler who had mastered both war and peace. But for those who knew the palace from the inside, it was clear that the great king's circle was shrinking. The walls of suspicion he had built to protect himself were now closing in, shutting out not only danger but also genuine counsel and connection. The isolation was self-imposed, but no less real for it. In the empire's provinces, governors carried out his policies with the same mixture of efficiency and ruthlessness that had marked his own rule. Taxes flowed steadily to the capital, roads remained secure for trade, and yet the human cost, uprooted families, silenced dissent, fearful loyalty, was an unspoken shadow over the Safavid glory. Occasionally, Abbas allowed himself gestures of apparent warmth. He might ride through the city in disguise, buying a piece of bread from a market stall, speaking with craftsmen, listening to grievances. These moments were remembered fondly by the people, adding to his legend as a ruler who walked among them. But for Abbas, they may also have been something else, a way to touch the world outside the suffocating caution of the court. Time, however, does not slow for kings. By the late 1620s, Abbas was aging. The vigour of his youth was tempered by illness and fatigue. He had won great victories and built a capital to rival any in the world, but the dynasty he would leave behind was a weaker thing than the one he had inherited. Whether he admitted it or not, the truth was unavoidable. The measures that had secured his reign had eroded the foundations of the Safavid future. The Shah, who had feared being overthrown, had made himself irreplaceable, and in doing so had ensured that the empire would struggle without him. And so, even before his death, the great king found himself a solitary figure, surrounded by splendour yet standing alone in the very palace he had once filled with promise. History is often told as a series of events, wars fought, cities built, rulers crowned. But to understand Shah Abbas, we have to look deeper, past the dates and victories, into the layers of fear and survival that shaped him. His cruelty toward his own family was not an isolated act. It was the endpoint of a lifetime shaped by instability. The first root lay in his childhood. Abbas had grown up in a palace where trust was fragile and alliances dissolved overnight. His mother's murder when he was still a boy was more than a personal tragedy. It was a brutal lesson. In the world of kings, love was conditional, loyalty was temporary, and security was an illusion. That lesson would become the bedrock of his reign. The second root was the history of the Safavid dynasty itself. From its very beginning, the Safavid throne had been anything but secure. Shahs had been overthrown by their brothers, sons, or ambitious cousins. Coups often came from within the royal household. Abbas knew the family tree could be as dangerous as any foreign army. The third root was the nature of absolute power. Once Abbas consolidated authority, there were no checks, no parliament, no council strong enough to challenge him. This meant that his fears, whether grounded in fact or born of paranoia, were free to dictate policy. In a system where one man's suspicion was enough to decide the fate of princes, there was nothing to stop suspicion from becoming a weapon. From these roots grew a worldview in which every relationship was a potential threat. This is why Abbas relied so heavily on the ghulams, foreign-born soldiers and administrators who had no claim to the throne, no tribal loyalties, no family ties in Persia. They were loyal precisely because they had nowhere else to turn. But the reliance on outsiders also deepened his mistrust of native elites and even his own kin. When we view the blinding of his sons through this lens, it becomes tragically logical. In Abbas's mind, he was not simply destroying his family, he was removing chess pieces that might one day be used against him. Muhammad Baqir's charisma and popularity were dangerous assets. The younger prince's potential to lead was a risk in itself. In a dynasty where coups were often family affairs, Abbas decided that prevention meant permanent disqualification. It is telling that Abbas's actions did not occur in the heat of rage. They were calculated. The blinding was done quietly, the executions discreet. This was not the chaos of a tyrant losing control, it was the cold efficiency of a man who believed he was protecting the state. Yet in trying to protect the Safavid state, Abbas undermined its most important safeguard, the orderly succession of capable rulers. When he died, there would be no strong son to take his place, only distant relatives, untested, and in some cases, unprepared for the burdens of kingship. The throne would pass to his grandson Safi, a boy raised in the stifling fear that had become the hallmark of Abbas's court. The empire that Abbas had strengthened militarily would begin to weaken politically, eroded by the absence of decisive leadership. Abbas's reign is a paradox that has confounded historians for centuries. On one side stands the reformer and builder, the man who modernized the army, reclaimed lost territories, and transformed Isfahan into a wonder of the world. On the other side stands the paranoid autocrat, the man who uprooted populations, silenced dissent, and maimed his own heirs. In Persian culture, Abbas is still remembered with a mix of admiration and condemnation. Folk tales celebrate his cleverness and his disguised walks among the people, but family histories in Armenia and Georgia pass down the memory of forced marches and lost homelands. Among historians, he is both the great and the ruthless. The truth is that these two portraits are not contradictions, they are inseparable halves of the same man. The achievements that made Abbas a national hero sprang from the same relentless vigilance that made him a family destroyer. His greatness and his cruelty were not separate paths, they were parallel lines, running together until they met at the end of his life. By the time he died, Abbas had proven himself right in one way. No one had managed to overthrow him. But in every other sense he had lost. He had secured the present at the cost of the future, and the dynasty that bore his name would never again reach the heights it knew under his reign. By 1628, Shah Abbas was an old man by the standards of his era. The sharp-eyed warrior who had once ridden at the front of his armies now moved more slowly, his body bearing the weight of decades in the saddle and the strain of unrelenting vigilance. Illness crept in, pain in the joints, fatigue that lingered for days. Yet even in his last years, he held the reins of power tightly, unwilling to surrender control. The question of succession, however, could no longer be ignored. His blinding of Imam Qoli Mirza and Muhammad Mirza had removed them from the line, and the execution of Muhammad Baqir had left a void that no distant cousin could easily fill. The court's attention turned to a boy, his grandson Safi, the son of the murdered baker. Safi was young, sheltered, and had grown up in a court where fear was the main tutor. He had never commanded an army, never governed a province, never faced the storms of politics that had shaped his grandfather. Abbas knew this, and perhaps in quieter moments, he recognized the fragility of what he was leaving behind. But public acknowledgement was not in his nature. To admit that the dynasty was vulnerable would be to admit that his own policies had weakened it. In the winter of 1629, Abbas's health failed rapidly. He withdrew to the coastal city of Mazandaran, seeking the milder climate. But even the soft air of the Caspian could not slow the inevitable. Courtiers whispered in corridors, their words a mix of anticipation and dread. The Shah, who had been the empire's shield for over 4 decades, was slipping away. On January 19th, 1629, Shah Abbas the Great died. There were no grand last speeches recorded, no deathbed reconciliations. He left the world as he had ruled it, on his own terms, in control until the end, with his emotions locked away from public view. His death unleashed a quiet anxiety across the empire. In Isfahan, the markets closed in mourning, but behind the black-draped shopfronts, merchants wondered if the roads would remain safe. Soldiers stationed in distant provinces questioned whether orders from the capital would carry the same weight without Abbas's name attached. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent reports home, speculating whether the Safavid military machine would hold together. Safi was crowned Shah Safi I at the age of 17. His reign began under the shadow of his grandfather's legacy, a vast, powerful empire paired with a hollowed-out royal family. The young Shah inherited a centralized state, a professional army and a glittering capital. But he also inherited a court dominated by cautious bureaucrats and eunuchs, men who had learned under Abbas to keep the ruler isolated from dissent. Safi had none of Abbas's political instincts, none of his hard-earned authority, and none of the credibility that came from decades of leadership. Within a few years, the weaknesses began to show. Safavid military victories became rarer. Corruption seeped into the bureaucracy. Provincial governors, sensing the inexperience of the new ruler, began to push against the boundaries of central control. The empire Abbas had spent his life fortifying was still standing, but the cracks were widening. This was the true verdict of history. Abbas had been unmatched in preserving his own reign, but in doing so he had set the stage for the dynasty's decline. His paranoia had cleared the path for him alone, and once he was gone there was no one of equal stature to walk it. Yet for many Persians, Abbas remained a hero long after his death. The roads he built still carried caravans. The bridges still spanned rivers. The mosques and palaces of Isfahan still dazzled visitors. These tangible achievements allowed his legend to survive, even as the political reality he left behind grew more unstable. In this dual memory, glory and ruin, lies the essence of Shah Abbas's reign. He was both builder and destroyer, a man who could expand borders and enrich his people while also dismantling the very foundation of the dynasty's survival. His empire outlived him, but the damage done to its future was irreversible. When we look back, we see a ruler who mastered the game of power so completely that he forgot the one rule every dynasty depends on. No matter how great the king, he must leave the throne to someone capable of holding it. Abbas had secured his place in history, but in securing himself, he had doomed his heirs. Centuries have passed since Shah Abbas walked the marble halls of Isfahan, yet his presence still lingers, in architecture, in memory, and in the contradictions that define his reign. The Safavid mosques still stand, their turquoise domes catching the morning light. The bridges he commissioned still carry footsteps across the Zayandeh River. The city he reshaped remains a marvel to visitors from around the world. For many Persians, Abbas is remembered first as the builder the man who transformed Isfahan into half the world, a city that rivaled the great capitals of the East and West. Schoolbooks recount his victories over the Ottomans, his expansion of trade, his alliances with European powers. In the national narrative, he is the figure who rescued the Safavid Empire from decline and gave it decades of stability. But beneath the grandeur lies another memory, one less often celebrated. In Armenian history, Abbas's name evokes the tragedy of 1604, when hundreds of Thistans were uprooted from their homes and driven into exile for strategic purposes. In Georgian and Circassian memory, he is the conqueror who took their youth as gulams, severing them from their families, and within his own bloodline his reign is marked by the maiming and execution of his heirs, acts that robbed the dynasty of capable leadership. Historians continue to debate how these two legacies fit together. Some argue that Abbas's paranoia was a rational response to the volatile politics of the Safavid court, that without his ruthless measures, the dynasty might have fallen decades earlier. Others see his suspicion as excessive, a personal flaw that undermined the very stability he sought to preserve. What is undeniable is the duality of his rule. Abbas embodied both the vision of a statesman and the caution of a man who never stopped looking over his shoulder. His reforms in the army, his encouragement of trade, his patronage of the arts, these were acts of a ruler who wanted to strengthen his country. But his purges, his scorched earth campaigns, and his destruction of his own heirs reveal the toll that absolute power exacts on a human mind. In the popular imagination, these contradictions often blur. Tourists in Isfahan admire the splendour of the Naqshi Jahan Square, without knowing it was built by a man who feared his own sons. Visitors to New Julfa might marvel at the thriving Armenian community without realising it was born out of forced relocation and mass suffering. Abbas's legacy is woven into the fabric of the city, but so too are the costs of his decisions. Modern scholarship has also reshaped his image. Earlier Persian historians, writing under later dynasties, often portrayed Abbas in heroic terms, glossing over his darker acts. In recent decades, historians have given more attention to the human impact of his policies, the displacement, the fear, the silencing of dissent. The result is a more nuanced picture. Abbas as neither pure villain nor pure hero, but as a man shaped by the ruthless realities of his time, who achieved greatness and committed grave wrongs in equal measure. This complexity makes him a figure who still sparks debate. In classrooms, he can be presented as a model of strong leadership and modernisation. In human rights discussions, he can be cited as an example of how unchecked power leads to abuses, even against one's own family. His reign becomes a case study in the paradox of rule, how the same qualities that make a leader effective can also sow the seeds of disaster. The long shadow of Shah Abbas is not just about what he built or destroyed, it is about the warning embedded in his story. Power, once concentrated, a single pair of hands can achieve remarkable feats. But when fear takes root in those hands, power turns inward, consuming the very people it was meant to protect. 4 centuries later, Abbas remains an enigma. The turquoise tiles still gleam, the bridges still span the river, and the city he loved still breathes with life. Yet for those who look closely, the silence in certain palace gardens speaks louder than any monument. It is the silence left by sons who never lived to inherit the throne, and by a dynasty whose brightest future was extinguished by the man who gave it its greatest past. In the end, Shah Abbas's story is not just the biography of a ruler, it is a warning. It tells us that a leader can save a nation and destroy it in the same lifetime. That the same hands which build palaces can also sign orders that blind sons. That fear, once it becomes the lens through which a ruler sees the world, will twist every act into a defence against the imagined enemies. Abbas had everything a monarch could desire: military triumphs, economic revival, a capital that drew the admiration of the world. Yet he died without a capable heir, his dynasty weakened, his family shattered. The palace walls he built to keep danger out also kept out trust, love, and counsel. The great king left behind an empire rich in beauty but hollow at its core. History's judgment is rarely simple. Some will remember Abbas as the visionary who modernised Persia, secured its borders, and gave it architectural wonders. Others will remember the forced marches, the scorched villages, and the silent corridors where heirs once walked. But perhaps the truest way to remember him is to see both at once, the light and the shadow inseparable. The blood lesson of Shah Abbas is that power without restraint does not just corrupt, it consumes. It will consume rivals, allies, strangers, and if left unchecked, it will consume those we claim to love. It is a lesson written not only in the annals of the Safavid court, but in the lives of every people touched by his reign. And so, centuries later, we walk the squares of Isfahan, marvel at the domes, and trace the calligraphy with our eyes. But if we listen closely, beneath the hum of the markets and the rush of the fountains, we might still hear the faint echo of a command given long ago, a father's voice, cold and unshaking, "Take his eyes." This is not just the story of a king, it is the story of what happens when fear is given a throne. If you've journeyed with me through this history, through its triumphs, its cruelties, and its hard truths, consider subscribing to the Nameless Scribe. Here, we uncover the untold, the forgotten, and the buried chapters of our shared past. Because the lessons of history are only lost if we choose not to hear them.